in this episode of the Critical Oxygen podcast.
So cycling, it would be like 88 to 93%. High zone 3, low zone 4. So kind of right on the cusp between like your tempo and pace and then your transitioning to your threshold pace.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Critical Oxygen podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today I'm joined again by Coach Dave Schell for another episode of Fast Physiology, where we're going to talk about sweet spot or gray zone training. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me again, Phil.
Yeah, so all of these topics that Dave and I are going to touch on Fast Physiology are all things that we have noticed or gotten athletes who have come to us before, and we just want to address with people because, as Dave said during, kind of like the intro episode of Fast Physiology, is that the whole point is that there's a lot of tools that you can put in your toolbox, but not everything is a nail, so you can't always just use a hammer.
Right.
So today, that topic is zone 3 or sweet spot training or gray zone training. Depends on who you're talking to and what their proclivity for this type of training is on the answer that you get. But Dave, you want to give me your experience with this and why you want to address it?
Yeah, so I think first let's come up with a definition of this. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a little bit different with cycling versus running, because I think in running is where that whole gray zone thing came from. So cycling, it would be high zone 3, low zone 4. So kind of right on the cusp between like your tempo and pace and then your transitioning to your threshold pace. So
like 85% to maybe 100% of FTP?
Well, so like 88 to 93%.
88.475.
Yeah, so very specific. Okay. And there's a story behind that too, where it's kind of funny where in the beginning it wasn't an official zone, and so it was kind of like the name. They were testing out the new software WKO, and so as they were testing it out, there was a group of coaches that were helping with this new concept of training stress score. And one of the coaches, Frank Overton, who's the owner of FastCat, he had kind of come to the realization that if he rode at this like kind of hard effort, he would accumulate more TSS than if he was just like at zone 2 or, and he could do more volume in it than if he was training right at threshold. Mm-hmm. And so they started calling it the sweet spot. And so at that time, it was just kind of like Hunter Allen, who is the other author of Racing and Training with a Power Meter, in addition to Andy Coggin, like they would like go back and forth, and Hunter wanted there to be specific percentages, and Andy's like, no, it's not really a zone. And so now with WKO4, which came out in like 2014, they actually made it an official zone and like gave it specific percentages and stuff like that. So that's the history on it. Now, fast forward to today, I think it became kind of a staple of time crunched athletes. And it's again, because it's a way to accumulate a lot of training stress if you don't have a lot of time to train, and it feels very productive. And so people spend a lot of time there. And a lot of times athletes come to me and they've been doing a lot of sweet spot training. And in my experience, it creates a lot of fatigue. And at some point you kind of hit the wall. And so I've heard like several of my athletes after like 4 to 6 weeks, they're like, wow, I didn't know that I didn't have to be tired all the time, And so, and that was as we like lowered the intensity a bit, but then increased the volume and then added more specific intensity along the way and stuff like that. And so, yeah, just like we were talking about zone 2, the last episode, this also tends to be like the only tool in a lot of people's toolbox, and people gravitate towards it. So yeah, that's my quick summary of that.
I've experienced similar things within the running community, because that's my primary background, where and this is where gray zone training is actually deemed, because in running, because it's a weight-bearing sport, if you're running at an intensity that is, or it just the more you're running and the faster you're running, the more fatigue that you're going to accumulate, right? That's kind of the bottom line. And you have less wiggle room in running because it is such a high impact sport compared to cycling. This is where, coaches and athletes have started to deem it gray zone training, or like the no-go zone, because what they were finding is that individuals who would just go out, run hard, for their 45 minutes to an hour and then come back, they would, initially get better, because that's what happens with anything that you do, is you initially get better if you can respond to the stress. But then they would kind of just either plateau, get burnt out, because it is kind of hard to run that fast every single day, or they get injured or sick or not be consistent. So, so the shift to that is people were seeing that and they're like, oh, well, we need to shift away from that. So that's going to be the gray zone. And this is kind of where 80-20 comes in, right? 80-20 is it gave people permission to go easier on their easy days and harder on their harder days, as opposed to just hitting that middle zone, that sweet spot every single day, and then essentially not, fully realizing their potential. I will say, though, there is a time and a place, just like there's a time and a place for pretty much any intensity within training, where if your race is between, I don't know, under or more than maybe an hour, but less than probably like 4 hours or something like that, 1 to 4 or 5 hours, sweet spot training definitely has a place, especially as you get closer to that race, because it's going to be closer to that intensity that you're going to be able to maintain for, the 2 to 4 hours, as opposed to just, 1 hour, which would be FTP. So then you want to, push your 1 hour FTP up. Or if you're doing, a 10-hour race, then you're going to really want to be doing, a lot of your specific training at way closer to that zone 2, like we talked about in the first episode.
Yeah, and I think that's the important point, and I think we've talked about periodization before, moving from general to the specific, and as you get closer to a race, you want to do more race-paced training. And so for many events, and especially in mountain biking, much of your climbs, even though your average power for the 4 to 6 hours is going to be like zone 2, maybe zone 3, your climbs are going to be like mid to high zone 3 or sweet spot. So it does make sense to spend a lot of time training there to get your muscles used to the specific demands of the event. And so, yeah, I think it's just, again, it's a tool, not the only tool.
Yeah, I think what people are going to find out is that a lot of the times there's probably going to be a little bit of a clickbaity title on a lot of these, fast physiology talks, but I hope that we come across as a little bit more of like the moderators for discussing what the tool is, right? Gray zone training or sweet spot training. It is good for that specific training and development. However, the challenge is that, like, so you were saying that there was a graph that's been, kind of thrown around, but the way that I visualize training adaptations is that if you have a 3-zone model, which is really kind of all we can measure in from a research setting, so we have first threshold, second threshold, and then VO2 max kind of capping our aerobic engine. In that zone 1, so sub first threshold. There's so much terminology. That's something we need to talk about on Fast Physiology as well. Is like, what the heck is going on with all this terminology? So sub that for that first threshold, the amount of fatigue accumulation is pretty minimal. So if you're looking at it from like a graph perspective, it's fatigue accumulation based on intensity is fairly minimal. And then once you hit that first threshold, there's an uptick in that fatigue accumulation. And then when you hit that second threshold, there's an even steeper uptick. And I would say it's probably exponential as you get closer and closer to either VO2 max or your sprint capacity. That fatigue just goes through the roof, so you can't really do too much of it. But then on the flip side of things, the amount of physiological adaptation that you're also getting, you have to kind of think about how much physiological adaptation are you getting per unit of fatigue. And I think zone 2 training is touted as being great because really low fatigue, even though there's fairly low physiological adaptations that are happening, you're not overstepping those boundaries. High intensity training, I always liken it to if you're making a statue out of marble. High intensity is just like whacking off huge chunks of that marble, whereas zone 2 is kind of chiseling out, like the creases and stuff. And then within that boundary between threshold 1 and threshold 2, it's still to be determined if the amount of adaptation that you're getting, at least in my opinion, if that amount of adaptation that you're getting is worth or equal to or less than the stress of the actual work itself. Because most of the time when people go to specific training, it's for race prep and race performance. It's not to make their physiology better, which is a little bit more of what we're seeing from things like threshold work, high intensity work, zone 2 work, other things like that.
Yeah, and so I was excited to talk about this one because it's always a question that I like really consider is like what are the specific changes happening once we cross over that first threshold and start to get into the second, in between first threshold and second threshold. And so my understanding is we start to recruit more of the type 2A fibers. And so, and then burning more glycogen or carbohydrate as fuel at that point too. And so it becomes this question like, what are we trying to do? And so like really trying to approach it from that standpoint. And it's like, if we're also trying to improve the fiber or fatigue resistance of our type 1 fibers, is it going to be more beneficial to do a lot of more easy or moderate training? Or is it going to be good to like sit in that sweet spot and, you know, do less volume, but more intensity?
Mm-hmm. I know. And I think this is like, you know, a question that's going to be debated until the end of time is, you know, is it, what do you say? Like, you know, is that a rising tide raises all ships? Yeah. Or, so is that the idea that the lower intensity stuff is going to push, or what? I don't really even understand that, I guess, now that I said it. Yeah. What does that mean?
Well, yeah. So I think, I mean, we kind of talked about this in the last one where zone 2 or endurance training is the opposite side of the coin. And like, so I feel like everybody gravitates towards intensity because it feels really productive. And so it's kind of like the no pain, no gain thing, right? Like it's not doing anything if it doesn't feel hard. And so I think people get so focused on one side of it that they miss the other side of it. And so it's not just like how much, and this is going to sound really stupid, I'm sure, but like, so if we think about FTP, like part of it is like you're using a lot of fast twitch fibers and a lot of pyruvate and lactate are being produced. But what raises that is how much mitochondria you have in those type 1 fibers that can bring up that lactate and like and turn it back into fuel, right? And so that's what would like move your threshold. If we're talking about moving your lactate threshold, having more mitochondria is going to bump that up.
Right. And, you know, there's multiple ways of going about getting more mitochondria and more functional mitochondria. And it's the high intensity stuff gets you, well, at least seems to get you more function within your mitochondria. And then the lower intensity stuff seems to get you more mitochondria in general. So it's the combination of both that you really need in order to optimize, you know, that ability of your mitochondria to uptake that pyruvate so that it doesn't get converted into lactate or doesn't, you know, continues to buffer hydrogens and inorganic phosphates, which are really what's ultimately leading to fatigue. That's another episode we should do. And, you know, so it's one of those things where you get both. And I think there probably is some level of validity to doing that sweet spot training in the sense that if you're doing it in the context of making sure you're recovering enough from each of those sweet spot training days, then yeah, you probably get a mixture of increases to fatigue resistance for your type 2A fibers, because that's really, they're going to start to be recruited more after that first threshold. You're going to be able to get a little bit of that mitochondrial function because it's a little bit closer to that high intensity work that you want to do. But then the question is why not just do one or the other, right? Why not just do specifically
because you're time
high
crunched.
intensity?
And it goes back to what I said, right? And it's like, that's why it becomes very attractive to people. It's like, I don't have time to do 10 hours a week. And this is, I think this will be another episode we do, is just like about volume, but it's like, I've heard some coaches say 10 hours a week is a minimum. I've heard others say 14 hours a week is a minimum if you're going to continue to improve. And I saw it during the pandemic when all of a sudden my athletes had a lot more time to train and we started adding more volume for the first time in years. Everybody's FTPs started going up, and it wasn't from more intensity. It was just from riding more. And so,
Right.
yeah, back to your question. It's like, yeah, it's kind of like this Swiss Army knife thing where it's like, oh, I can just have something that's kind of good at everything, or I can do things that are really focused. And I think it was David Bishop that I was watching one of his things, and that's what I came away from it too, is that volume is good for mitochondrial density, and high intensity is good for function. And so it takes both sides of those coins, or that coin.
Yep. Yeah, and I would say too that I think people have a misconception, and we're kind of going off topic here for just a second, but I think people have a little bit of a misconception that volume needs to look like, oh, I'm riding my bike. If you're a cyclist or something like that. Zone 2 could be walking or jogging or hiking or gardening. Like, it's low level physical activity that is and yes, there is too low of physical activity that's not going to be really beneficial, but it's low level physical activity that is kind of like that volume sort of thing. For example, when I was I did a 50K back in May of this year, and most of my volume came from walking to and from school every single day and getting at least 10 to 20,000 steps a day. That's like 12 miles of walking per day. Yeah. You can't tell me that that's like not enough volume to get at least some, and maybe the adaptations aren't just mitochondrial and capillary based. Maybe it's because of my muscles were stronger, my tendons were stronger, my feet were more resilient to, running on trails and other things like that. Granted, I didn't go and crush it, I didn't win the 50K or anything like that, but I was able to do it on, fairly minimal, what most people would call training volume.
And I'll say I am a fan of that, and I'm not like a running coach. I used to coach triathletes, and I used to be an okay runner, but like, what I would say to that is, yes, I think to a point you can supplement volume with other aerobic type sports, but I think where some people get into trouble is like, and you reminded me of this recently as I started using a Moxie device. It's like, when we're talking about specificity, it's like what really matters is at the muscle. And so you walking is still specific to running for the most part. And like most trail running, there's going to be some hiking sections and stuff, but those same muscles aren't necessarily being recruited on the bike. And so you might get really fit running, but then you try to get on the bike, and like, even though you have the central engine to kind of like push everything, you don't have the peripheral mechanics to like take everything up, because it's like those muscles weren't recruited, right? Or fibers.
Yeah, or they're recruited in a different manner or something along those lines. So we got about 2 minutes left to make this a 20-minute episode. So big takeaways in terms of gray zone training, and you all are probably going to hear this a lot from both Dave and I, is and I keep calling it gray zone like it's got a negative connotation. It could also be called sweet spot. Sweet spot training is important for individuals, especially getting closer and more specific to a race. So doing more of that sweet spot training as you get closer to that race is going to allow you to become efficient at that movement pattern at the speed that you're going to be racing at. So don't just throw it out and don't just do 80-20. It's okay to have some sweet spot training. Just know when to put it in, and don't do it all the time, because if you're doing anything all the time, your body's going to adapt to that, and then you're not going to get as much gain or as much bang for your buck in terms of when you actually go to do that sweet spot training.
Yeah. And the thing that I'll add to this, and we should have talked about it during, but I think the other reason that people, at least cyclists, gravitate to it a lot is that most people are testing their FTP, doing a 20-minute test and taking 95% of that, and a lot of them might find that 95% feels too hard when they're doing threshold work. And so I think a lot of people gravitate towards sweet spot because it's probably closer to their actual threshold and what it should, like that kind of comfortably hard, like I could do this for a long time if I had to. And so I think that's just something to consider too, is if you like doing sweet spot and do a lot of it, it might be like, that's actually your threshold training, and you should kind of bump things down,
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of people have a tendency to overestimate or overprescribe intensity. And a lot of the times I think that it gets me into trouble all the time because I wind up hurt. I wind up sick. And if I would have just maybe done some sweet spot as opposed to threshold training, or, if I would have done lower zone 2 as opposed to, upper zone 2 training, I would have been able to stay more consistent. So the bottom line with all of this, right, is that there's a time and a place for all this stuff. And maybe your sweet spot is actually your threshold.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I'll take it.
So we'll stop it there. You can catch me at Critical02 on Instagram. You can catch Dave at Kaizen Endurance on Instagram, and I'll link to his website, his coaching website. So if you're interested in trying to get him as a coach, reach out to him for sure. And if you guys have any questions or anything like that, just reach out and DM us, or if you have any topics that you want us to cover, please let us know, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.
Take care.